Oklahoma is the land of second, third, and last chances. Who were the people that made it so? The Red River Institute of History, JohnJDwyer.com, me, Gwin Faulconer-Lippert, and our signature sponsor, Atwood's Stores, present Oklahoma Gold. Together with our Will Rogers Medallion-winning author-historian John J. Dwyer, we'll stitch the golden threads of Oklahoma history. It's Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history by the interesting stories you share. John J. Dwyer, what is this story?
Well, Gwen, today it's a unique episode of Oklahoma Gold. We consider a small portion of the life and legacy of an American patriot who never lived in the state, though he visited here multiple times and had friendships and important working relationships with numerous Oklahomans. Those included his good friendship with and even hero worship of legendary OU football coach Bud Wilkinson, his historic working relationship with the state's most powerful political leader, Robert S. Kerr, and his support of former Secretary of War and U.S. Ambassador to China, Patrick Hurley's efforts to save free China from communist overthrow. But his lasting impact on Oklahoma and us, its people, is why we remember him today. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born the privileged son of a New England tycoon. The handsome Irish American was an unlikely person to survive to adulthood, much less become the youngest president in American history. In his landmark book, JFK and the Unspeakable, author James W. Douglas summarized the many infirmities that beset Kennedy. He saw death approach repeatedly, wrote Douglas, from scarlet fever when he was 2 and 3 years old, from a succession of childhood and teen illnesses, from a chronic blood condition in boarding school, from what doctors thought was a combination of colitis and ulcers, from intestinal ailments during his years at Harvard, from osteoporosis and crippling back problems intensified by war injuries that plagued him the rest of his life, from the adrenal insufficiency of Addison's disease. And that's the end of that quote. Though John F. Kennedy's powerful father arranged a desk job for him during World War II, the young Kennedy defiantly enlisted in the regular Navy. He rose to command of a PT-109, a lethal fast attack craft that the Japanese called devil boats. Kennedy's legend began to grow when an enemy destroyer tore his boat in half in a Solomon Islands night battle. Some crewmen died and everyone else suffered wounds. Kennedy led the survivors to the closest island. He saved his bloodied engineer by swimming through ocean currents for 4 hours, gripping a strap from the man's life preserver in his teeth to tug his body. Already injured and exhausted, he nearly died making swimming and canoeing attempts into the open sea for help with Japanese warships in the vicinity before U.S. naval rescuers finally arrived. These and other experiences left a lasting impression on Kennedy. Its dominant element was to protect the children and young of America from ever experiencing the horrors he and his friends had during World War II. Shortly after the war ended, Kennedy penned these unusual words for a decorated, battle-hardened veteran. War will exist until that distant day when the conscientious objector enjoys the same reputation and prestige that the warrior does today, end quote. Well, when he ran for Congress the next year, Kennedy's driving motivation was the same as that of another war hero who would become president, but from the opposing political party. That other man was Dwight Eisenhower, and their shared goal was to be in the best position to protect the young of America from experiencing the horror of war that they themselves had. The congressional campaign of Kennedy, still in his 20s and a complete political novice, and facing 2 popular experienced politicians, struggled. One January day, he decided to speak to an American Legion Hut gathering of Gold Star mothers. That organization consists of American mothers who have lost sons or daughters serving their country in the United States Armed Forces. Kennedy, at that point, no great orator, to put it nicely, spoke for about 10 minutes regarding the sacrifices of war and his concern to keep the world at peace. Sensing the Gold Star mothers were no more excited about his talk than he himself was, he stopped speaking for several seconds. Then, his throat tight and his voice halting, he said quietly, "I think I know how all you mothers feel. My mother is a Gold Star mother too." This pronouncement stunned the group, few of whom knew Kennedy, and perhaps none of whom knew of his own family's loss. He began to speak of his heroic older brother Joe, who had died a patriot's death on a solo, top-secret volunteer bombing mission over Germany. Joe was posthumously awarded the Elite Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism in combat. Upon the birth of Joe, even more handsome and charismatic than his younger brother John, their father had declared, "This child, Joseph Kennedy Jr., is the future president of the nation." Well, learning about Joe and the heartbreak of his devout Catholic mother Rose from John Kennedy's soft, unpolished, clearly unrehearsed words produced the greatest emotional response from the roomful of grieving mothers that any of Kennedy's supporting staff had ever witnessed. Without waiting for him to conclude his talk, the mothers rose from their seats and rushed to him en masse, crowding around him, shaking his hand, talking to him excitedly. Kennedy aide Dave Powers heard numerous of them telling one another, "Isn't he a wonderful boy? Why, he reminds me so much of my own John or my Bob." And the rest, Gwin, as they say, is history. But what history it was. As a congressman, Kennedy tried to keep the French from dragging America into Vietnam in the 1950s. As president, he thwarted the CIA's disastrous attempt to drag the U.S. into a nuclear war over Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion, and audaciously vowed, quote, to splinter the CIA in 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds, end quote. Then he led America to one of its greatest diplomatic and foreign policy victories over Soviet Russia in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear war. Well, those are some of his known life, Gwin. And following the break, we'll look at some of the unknown.
So why are you choosing JFK today?
You know, I'm sure a lot of people are going to ask that in an Oklahoma Gold show, that we don't regularly choose people from outside the state. It's because not only did he have a unique set of relationships with a lot of Oklahomans in different ways, but having studied American history for decades now, not just Oklahoma, and having lived long enough now to look back over the expanse of these events and seeing now with the passage of time what an incredible impact that one man had on us and our children, especially because there's so much said and written about him. There's so much confusion. I just thought he was an important person for us to know about, and there are qualities of his that I want our young people to emulate.
You wanted our young people to emulate. The Golden Nugget when we return. This is Oklahoma Gold. Dignifying our history through the people that changed American history. John J. Dwyer, what's the golden nugget of JFK?
Well, Gwin, as his presidency progressed, John F. Kennedy demonstrated a rare phenomenon for a national leader, the ability not only to learn, but to change and grow in both his job and life. In the presidency, he secretly worked to build a diplomatic bridge with communist Cuban dictator Fidel Castro that could lift the suffering people of that nation out of poverty and despair. He pulled thousands of American boys out of Vietnam the last year of Kennedy's life, 1963, and issued a secret memorandum to remove them all by the end of 1965. He secretly labored with Russian leader Nikita Khrushchev to stop the production of nuclear weapons. And he spoke up, carefully at first, but then boldly, even on national TV in his famous civil rights address, for the constitutional rights of America's black population in an era when that was not popular, but was in fact potential suicide to his presidential reelection chances. Knowing full well that all of these efforts against the fierce opposition of many, not least what we 21st century Americans would now call the deep state, knowing that they could imperil his own life, but continuing on anyway, is a lasting profile in courage. It is why I draw strength and direction on how to be a good man, father, and grandfather from the memory of JFK. Now, his piteous sexual addiction is well chronicled. Not so much is the profound impact on both he and his wife Jackie of the death of their newborn son Patrick only a few months before JFK's murder. Also, how it strengthened the relationship. Weeks before the president's death, Jackie startled him by expressing her enthusiasm to go with him to Texas, her first real political trip. She worried, though, about the ominous rumors they had heard regarding what might await him there. Jackie, he told her their last night in Washington, D.C., if somebody wants to shoot me from a window with a rifle, nobody can stop it, so why worry about it? That's right. The last morning of Kennedy's life, Jackie told him she would go anywhere with him. Well, recognizing that victory in a nuclear war was no victory at all, Kennedy made no secret of why nothing could stop his pursuit of peace. I keep thinking of our children and our grandchildren, he said. Not my kids or yours, but the children all over the world. They have no lobby here in Washington, end quote. Well, no child in his life was more precious to John Kennedy than his little daughter Caroline. A few weeks before his death, as he met with his National Security Council in the White House Rose Garden, she suddenly appeared next to him and announced that she wanted to tell him something. He tried to divert her as the high-level meeting continued, but she would not be deterred. Finally, he smiled, turned to her, and told her to go ahead. As the NSC watched, Caroline Kennedy looked up into her father's eyes and recited in its multiversed entirety his favorite poem, Rendezvous. Alan Seeger, a fellow Harvard graduate and war hero, wrote it prior to his own death in World War I. JFK's National Security Council advisors sat stupefied following Caroline's recitation. One of them later declared that the bond between father and 4-year-old daughter was such that it was as if there was an inner music he was trying to teach her. God knows, went the words of Rendezvous, the final stanzas. That was JFK's favorite poem. God knows 'twere better to be deep, pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death at midnight in some flaming town when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous. Well, he certainly was well aware, better than anyone else could have been, how vehemently opposed were powerful forces against him. But in that day and time, when the Cold War with the Soviet Union, Russia, was at its apex and people lived in daily fear, it was a very different time on many different fronts. And the point is that John F. Kennedy was a lifelong learner. He read, he studied, and he, I believe, seemed to have a compass that constantly goaded him toward what the right was, not what the expedient or the popular was. That's why we call him in our Oklahomans 2 book the Maverick President. You could not pin him down. Everybody claims him now, everybody from the right wing to the left wing and in between. He was an American patriot. He loved his children, and he gave his life for his country.
Now that's Oklahoma Gold.